So it's been a while since I did a straight up Naruto theory video. Now that's mostly because there's not a whole lot of theories left to cover. And pretty much any and all theories that I get emailed are 100% nonsensical, or we've just already talked about them in some capacity. And I don't want to reskin, oh, Lord Joshin might be an Otsutsuki for the 4th time. However, things changed today, because today I got an email with a theory that was not only compelling, but also possible. Because while that may not seem like a big caveat, trust me, if you've ever seen my email, it absolutely is a big caveat. Because it's not hard for a theory to sound interesting, but for a theory to sound plausible, that's quite the hurdle. And yet today, for the first time in what's felt like months, I got an email with a theory that not only was fun, but also plausible. And more than that, this theory answers questions. Long-standing, very important questions. And for a theory to have all 3 of those things is absolutely massive. So what is this theory I'm talking about? What are the questions that it answers, and why am I so excited about its plausibility? Well, the theory we're going to be talking about today revolves around Obito, the Uchiha massacre, and Yagura. But maybe more importantly than anything, it revolves around Wicked Eye Fugaku. See, because the theory we're going to be talking about today asks the question, a question I've never once thought to ask: did Obito use Fugaku's eyes to control the Hidden Mist Village? That is to say, was Obito using the wicked eyes of Fugaku to make Yagura his puppet? See, because for the longest time, we have never truly understood why Obito decided to partake in the Uchiha massacre. We also don't know what Fugaku's MS abilities were, or how Yagura, a perfect Jinchuriki, was placed under Genjutsu. On top of that, as crazy as all of this sounds, this theory could also possibly explain why Itachi didn't take his father's eyes. Yes, that's right, some ladies and mostly gentlemen, today we're going to be answering 4 of the most important, lingering questions in Naruto, with just one little teensy theory. And if that doesn't get your blood going, I don't know what does. But before we get anybody's blood circulating, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me circulating your blood while talking about other kinds of anime, go ahead and follow my other page, The Weeb Commander, where instead of talking about Naruto and Boruto, I talk all other anime and manga. And if you just want to see some blood circulating around a table, then go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Daddy Mata break down everything that happens in anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, have you ever woken up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and truly wondered, as you sat there looking into the expansive darkness of your room, why did Obito go through with the Uchiha massacre? No? You haven't? Well, congratulations on not being terrifying to everybody you live with. But it's these kinds of questions that have plagued me for the majority of my career as an anime YouTuber. Long-standing, incredibly important questions that seemingly never will get an answer. And thus, this is kind of where I've made a lot of hay as an anime YouTuber, answering these long-standing questions. Because for all intents and purposes, we were never truly given a reason that Obito decided to massacre the Uchiha alongside Itachi. Itachi was simply spying on the Uchiha one night, saw him sneaking into the Uchiha hideout, said, "Hey, I think I recognize you, you're Madara, right?" Obito rolled with the punches and was like, "Yeah, I guess." And then Itachi was like, "Well, you feel scorned by the Uchiha, right? Let's take him out together." At which point, Obito simply just did. And it's even worse the more information you know, because Itachi was assigned to killing the fighters of the Uchiha clan, while Obito elected to kill the non-fighting women and children. Which seems like a massive switch in personality from the Obito who used to be late to every single mission because he needed to help old people. So the incredible natural question to ask when you hear about Obito's role in the Uchiha massacre is, why did he do that? Especially when you consider the fact that he probably had to kill his own family. And while every Obito apologist under the sun will say, "Oh, Obito was probably just an orphan," we don't know that. But this isn't the only question that spurred out of that night, because as Itachi was cutting down all of the fighters of the Uchiha clan, one of those fighters was his own father, who just prior to Itachi killing him told Itachi, "If I was to fight back, it would be a battle of Mangekyo Sharingan, and I don't want to do that with my own son." And Itachi, who would later go on to program the Kodo Matsukame to react to his own eyes because he knew Sasuke would take them, for some reason didn't take his father's eyes, even though if he had taken his father's eyes, he would have been able to awaken EMS and probably live a much longer and healthier life. So why didn't Itachi take these eyes? Well, it's a possibility that was the terms of agreement for Obito joining the whole "let's kill our families" mission. Yes, that's right. This theory states that the only reason that Obito went through with the massacre was to acquire Fugaku's eyes, as Obito was fully aware that Fugaku's wicked eyes would be the only way he'd be able to keep the Hidden Mist village under his thumb. And this theory makes a fair amount of sense. I mean, Fugaku was known as Wicked Eye Fugaku, and while we don't know what his MS abilities were, we do know that there was a clear and present threat that his MS ability would allow for him to control Kurama, something that only the likes of Obito and Madara had shown the ability to do prior to this. In fact, a large reason that the Uchiha were relegated to the Uchiha side of the village was because it was pretty well known that Fugaku had the ability to control Kurama, and therefore Kushina's death on the night of Naruto's birth could have been his fault. However, ironically, Hiruzen and Danzo stopping the Uchiha from going to help in the battle against Kurama is probably the reason Kushina and Minato ended up dying, as Wicked Eye Fugaku probably could have seized control of Kurama from Obito. And while, like I already said, we don't know whether or not Fugaku's MS ability was truly Genjutsu based, since MS abilities seem to be at least somewhat genetic, considering the fact that both Sasuke and Itachi got Amaterasu, it's not crazy to assume that Itachi got Tsukiyomi from Fugaku, or some iteration of a Genjutsu pass-off. Because if Fugaku did have Tsukiyomi, that wouldn't exactly help Obito in controlling the Hidden Mist. On top of that, the Genjutsu used on Yagura was estimated to be by Tsunade related to Koto Matsukame, which made Tsunade come to the realization that either Shisui and Obito were related, or their Genjutsu ocular abilities were related. And while Shisui and Itachi were not related, they were best friends, but they weren't related, they weren't cousins or anything, they were just both Uchihas, MS abilities manifest based off the personality of the manifester. And Kagami Uchiha, Shisui's grandfather, who was said to have greater ocular prowess than even Shisui, was so powerful he was assigned to Tobirama's guard detail. And Fugaku, as the current, at least prior to the Uchiha massacre, was at least one of, if not the strongest Uchiha in the clan. And thus, since Shisui and Itachi's lineages were basically royalty in the Uchiha clan, there's a fair amount of possibility that Fugaku probably knew Shisui's dad. And since MS abilities manifest based off the feelings of the manifester in the moment they're manifesting them, there's a possibility that Fugaku's relationship with Shisui's father possibly impacted his MS abilities. But that's a stretch, and we're not going to assume that much. But it is rather widely assumed that Fugaku's MS abilities were Genjutsu based. So there is a possibility, if Obito were to steal Fugaku's eyes out of his corpse, he could possibly use Fugaku's Genjutsu to control the Hidden Mist. But does that theory make sense? Well, unfortunately for you, and fortunately for me, because I love talking numbers, the answer lies in the timeline. See, here's the thing. The time period we're going to be talking about is one of the hazier ones in the Naruto universe. The time period floating around the Uchiha massacre after Obito's presumed death is a bit fuzzy, but we do have enough information to piece together enough of an argument to either prove this theory correct or put it in the ground forever. And thus, it's about time we start talking years. See, the reason talking about timeline is so incredibly important when talking about this theory is because we know at a certain point, Obito starts controlling the Hidden Mist from the shadows. We learned this from Kisame's backstory when the Cypher Corps were able to get into his brain for a couple of minutes before he bit off his own tongue and killed himself. But if we're gonna make the assumption that Obito used Fugaku's eyes to control the Hidden Mist, then we have to assume that he couldn't control the Hidden Mist until after the Uchiha massacre. And while some of you might be saying, oh, well, the Uchiha massacre happened so long ago, there's no way Obito did it before the Uchiha massacre. Unfortunately, you're kind of wrong. Obito is old. And in terms of relative Naruto events, the Uchiha massacre is actually one of the more recent ones. But still, even with that in mind, it's close. See, it's been a while since we've done a big old timeline video, so I'm gonna quickly recap the rules. When I say something like year 55, that's 55 years since the foundation of Konoha. AK, we'll call it, after Konoha. And thus, if a year is higher, it's closer to the modern day of Naruto and Boruto. And if a year is lower, it's further back in time. Kind of like how our years work. You got it? Good. Let's move forward. Now, well, technically, none of this is 1000% accurate because timeline's kind of a mess in Naruto. Conservative estimates place the Uchiha massacre at year 72. Now, we're able to pretty concretely say when the Uchiha massacre was because we know how old Itachi and Sasuke were when the Uchiha massacre happened. And since we know how old Kakashi is and the age gap between Kakashi and Obito, we can also figure out that during the Uchiha massacre, Obito was 23, as opposed to Itachi's 13 and Sasuke's 7. Now, Obito being 23 is already pretty immediately a bad start for this theory, because Obito presumably dies in the Third Great Shinobi World War at 13 years old, which means that there is an entire decade between Obito's presumed death and the Uchiha massacre.
But Nikki wasn't conscious for all that. He lost half his body. He couldn't move around.
You're right. Obito isn't active for that entire decade, but he's active for much more of that decade than he's inactive. See, conservative estimates say that Rin probably died a year after Obito. And while there's really no way for us to confirm that, it's pretty much agreed upon. One, because Kakashi and Rin don't get any visibly older between Rin and Obito's deaths. And two, Rin dies in the same war that Obito dies in. And honestly, Rin and Obito dying a year apart might even be a stretch, because the bridge mission that Obito, Kakashi, and Rin undertake in the Third Great Shinobi World War, and successfully pull off, mind you, crippled the supply line of the Hidden Stone into the Land of Grass, and thus basically took them out of the Third Great Shinobi World War. Tie this into the fact that the Hidden Sand was fighting a defensive war in the Third Great Shinobi World War, which is why Sasori is known as Sasori of the Red Sand, and that the Hidden Lightning by this point had already lost the Third Raikage A in a 10,000-man battle, and the Hidden Mist was probably the last domino to fall in the Third Great Shinobi World War for Konoha. And thus, with the completion of the bridge mission, the Third Great Shinobi World War was starting to come to a close. But sure, if you want to say that took a year for Obito to get healed and radicalized by Madara, we'll say that. Which means there's a whole 9 years of time between Obito getting radicalized in the Uchiha massacre. And that's not great for the theory, because Madara was pulling the strings of the Hidden Mist, which is how he orchestrated Rin's death in the first place, and pretty much immediately after Madara was done radicalizing Obito by controlling the Hidden Mist into killing Rin, he unplugs himself from the Geto statue and dies. Which means for anywhere from 8 to 9 years, the Hidden Mist, assuming Obito wasn't using his own Sharingan, wouldn't be under his control. But a lot of you are probably saying right now,
But Nick, how could Obito be using his own Sharingan? His MS ability is Kamui.
and you're right, his MS ability is Kamui. But Obito's Sharingan has always been kind of weird. See, outside of the fact that Kamui is the most busted Sharingan ability you could ever possibly have, pretty much immediately after Obito is radicalized, he goes to Konoha to try and destroy it by releasing Kurama from Kushina on the night of Naruto's birth. 7 whole years before the Uchiha massacre. And what does Obito do on the night of Naruto's birth? Well, he places Kurama under Genjutsu. Now, mind you, this is Yellow Mask Obito, who, for all intents and purposes, should only have one Sharingan, as it's not like he took Madara's eyes, because Madara's eyes were very purposely placed in Nagato's very young face. And thus, unfortunately, 7 whole years before the Uchiha massacre, the precedent of Obito's almost limitless Genjutsu prowess was set. But maybe controlling a tailed beast like Kurama to simply rage and destroy everything around him, which Kurama probably would have wanted to do anyways, didn't require all that much in terms of Genjutsu prowess. I mean, it's not like he was directing Kurama in any particular direction. Kurama was just destroying everything, and Minato and Kushina put themselves between that destruction. And thus, we can possibly come to the conclusion that the level of Genjutsu that Obito used on Kurama wouldn't be enough to put a perfect Jinchuriki under Genjutsu for almost a decade. And thus, in order to build out some more evidence for this theory, we have to pop on over to the Hidden Mist. See, for those of you who don't remember, it's revealed pretty late into Naruto that Obito was controlling the Hidden Mist Village, and he trumped up the bloodlust of Yagura, the 4th Mizukage, to make him as violent a dictator as possible, which created the Blood Mist Village. And that was known as the Blood Mist Village for completely deranged tactics like making the Shinobi Academy graduates fighting each other to the death, which is how you got people like Zabuza, the Demon of the Mist, as Zabuza came from the last class of people to go through this barbaric way of graduating the Shinobi Academy because he killed all his other students. However, Zabuza wasn't a big fan of the Blood Mist Village. In fact, very few people were, and that's kind of exactly what Obito was going for. Obito had 2 real reasons for controlling the Hidden Mist Village. 1, to punish them for what they did to Rin, and 2, to have an area of massive discourse where he could move freely. In essence, while Obito was still walking around as Madara, the Hidden Mist Village was his Hidden Sound Village, an incredibly violent and mysterious place under his control that nobody else outside of it would ever want to go to. On top of this, Obito was dedicated to keeping it mysterious, as one of the practices of the Blood Mist Village was to hunt down anybody who ever defected and kill them. But because of these cruel practices, eventually Zabuza tried to lead a coup against the Hidden Mist. And around this same time, Kisame, Utakata, and Haku all defected from the Hidden Mist. Now, as to when this coup was, we don't know exactly, but most people estimate it was around year 71. Now, for those of you paying attention at home, a couple of minutes ago, I said the Uchiha massacre was in year 72. And if we're assuming that Kisame defected from the Hidden Mist at the same time as Zabuza, so around when the coup happened, this would mean that Kisame, who defected from the Hidden Mist because he realized Yagura was under the control of Obito, did so before Obito even participated in the Uchiha massacre. So that's it, right? Theory's dead? Well, no, not necessarily. See, the way that it's estimated that this coup happened in year 71 is largely based off appearance. See, I'll actually read you the online justification here. And by the way, I'm using a Tumblr resource that I use a fair amount made by this person called Keep Your Pants on Gohan. It's one of the most painstakingly comprehensive things I've ever seen created on the internet, and I adore it. And while it's not always 100% accurate, it is a very good stab in the dark. See, the online justification here is according to chapter 30, shortly before Zabuza defects from Kiri, he attempts a coup d'etat. Based on Haku's appearance at the time of his defection, he's no older than 10 years old. And Zabuza appears as a full-grown adult. Chapter 26 and 29 suggest that Haku and Zabuza had already been companions for some time prior to their defecting. Yagura's reign of the Blood Mist Village saw a number of defections from Kiri, including most of the ninja swordsmen and in the anime Utakata, so it's assumed these defections happened in a relatively close proximity to the Kekkei Genkai massacres. Now, what they're referring to by Kekkei Genkai massacres is the fact that members of the Blood Mist Village would kill people from the Land of Water with Kekkei Genkai, like Haku's clan's Ice Release. Now, this general disdain for Kekkei Genkai seems to run through the entirety of the Land of Water, as even the warring barbaristic Kaguya clan was terrified of Kimimaru because Kimimaru had the Shikatsu Myaku. I'll continue with the justification from Tumblr here. Notably, by this point, Obito is leading Kiri. According to chapter 507, Kisame claims in chapter 353 of part 2 that he saw Suigetsu 10 years prior, dating his defection at this time. The post continues with, in the anime, episode 126, the Kaguya clan's attack on Kiri and Kimimaru's subsequent orphaning take place on the same time as Haku's defection. Kimimaru is the same age as Haku. And that's a lot to digest, so let's break it down and see if it lines up with how I believe the timeline laid out. See, basically, the entire crux of saying that Zabuza's coup happened in year 71 is based off the appearances of Zabuza and Haku. And since we know how old Zabuza and Haku were when they died, if we're estimating that they needed to be together for a certain amount of time prior to their death, which would mean we would say, oh, if they had been together 3 to 4 years, that would mean when they defected, they were around this age, which makes sense because that's roughly how old they looked. This justification also hinges on the idea that all the defections that happened from the Hidden Mist happened roughly around the same time. And it's with this point that I actually don't agree. See, I find it highly likely that Utakata, Kisame, and Zabuza all defected roughly around the same time, because the only way to really justify that point would be to say that all 3 of them were involved in Zabuza's coup. And I can't help but feel like if the perfect Jinchuriki of Saiken, the wielder of Samehada, and the wielder of the Executioner's Sword all launched a coup against the Hidden Mist, which was already torn asunder by the fact that it had been the Blood Mist Village for a little while now, would have lost in that battle, as Zabuza did. And thus, if we're not assuming that all of these defections happened at the same time, as I'm not doing, then Kisame saying he hadn't seen Suigetsu in 10 years doesn't have to line up exactly with when Zabuza's coup was. However, I will admit that episode 126, though it isn't canon, but you know how we feel about non-canon episodes giving us information that we didn't have prior on this page, does point out that Haku and Kimimaru both get orphaned on the same day. Well, I guess it's actually more like they both find their parent figures on the same day, because Haku finds Zabuza and Kimimaru finds Orochimaru. Not 2 great parent figures, but parent figures nonetheless. But Nick, why are we trying so hard to separate Zabuza and Kisame's defection? Well, because Kisame's defection is a hard point in the manga that we can point at and say Obito was in charge of the Hidden Mist at this point through the powers of Genjutsu. And thus the most important question to answer when trying to figure out if this theory is correct or not is figuring out whether Kisame or Itachi joined the Akatsuki first. And no, we don't have a list of when each member of the Akatsuki joined in order. We know Yahiko, Konan, and Nagato joined up first, but pretty much after that is a mystery. Like, we know Orochimaru joined after Itachi. We know Hidan was the last to join. We know Deidara joined after Itachi. The video games told us that Sasori joined after Konan, but Konan's an OG member, so that doesn't really mean anything. So answering the question, who joined first, Kisame or Itachi, is not only really important, but also hard to answer. And the reason it's so important is because Itachi joins the Akatsuki immediately after the Uchiha massacre, and Kisame joins the Akatsuki immediately after defecting Kiri, which is our hard point in the manga, where we realize that Obito's controlling the Hidden Mist. So who do I think joined first? Itachi, actually. See, while Itachi and Kisame are partners in the Akatsuki during the Naruto timeline, Itachi had a partner in the Akatsuki before Kisame, Juzo Biwa, who was also one of the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist and a wielder of the Executioner Blade. Now, I'm aware that Juzo is not canon, but how do we feel about filler that gives us information we didn't have previously? And here's the thing. Outside of the fact that Itachi very clearly has a type, Itachi and Juzo were sent to the Hidden Mist Village in order to capture Yagura, as Yagura was the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails. However, Yagura battled back against them and ends up killing Juzo. How much of that story feels likely if Obito was already in charge of Yagura? See, because while Itachi is able to torch Yagura with Amaterasu and escape from the battle, there was a solid possibility that Yagura was not only going to kill 1, but 2 members of the Akatsuki that day. And if Itachi and Juzo were truly in the Hidden Mist trying to find Yagura to extract his 3 tails in Isobu, then would it make sense at this point if Kisame was already in the Akatsuki to send 2 former 7 Swordsmen of the Mist? Because not only had they definitely previously worked together, but also they both knew the area. On top of that, they would both know Yagura's moveset, as Juzo very clearly understands that Yagura, when he hits you, is able to grow coral around your body, something that Kisame also would have been privy to. And thus, the choice to send Itachi and Juzo seems to signal to me that Kisame wasn't in the Akatsuki yet. On top of that, Yagura battling back against the Akatsuki and killing members of the Akatsuki flies directly in the face of what Obito was trying to achieve, which makes me feel like Obito wasn't actually in charge of the Hidden Mist yet.
But Nick, wouldn't that tell us that there's a 9-year gap between Madara and Obito controlling the Hidden Mist Village?
Yeah, at least, actually. But here's the thing. We don't know if Obito knew that Madara was controlling the Hidden Mist. In fact, it can be largely assumed that Obito didn't know Madara was controlling the Hidden Mist. Why, you ask? Well, because if Obito did know that Madara was controlling the Hidden Mist on the night of Rin's death, he wouldn't be upset with the Hidden Mist, he'd be upset with Madara. And while Obito holds no particular love in his heart for Madara, can't help but feel his politics would be just a teensy bit different if he knew Madara was the reason that Rin died. And thus it seems rather clear to me, at least using the evidence that we do have, that Itachi having a partner prior to Kisame, who was also a member of the 7 Swordsmen of the Mist, seems to prove Itachi was in the Akatsuki first, which means our Uchiha massacre happened before the hard point in the manga, where we see that Obito's in charge of the Hidden Mist.
But Nick, doesn't Yagura die after the battle against Itachi?
No, he doesn't. Yagura doesn't die until deep into Naruto. We know this, 1, because of the 3-tail rescue arc, 2, because in the beginning of Naruto, Zabuza admits the gathering funds for a second coup against the Hidden Mist, which implies Yagura is still leading, and 3, because we know how Yagura dies. Yagura dies from shock after being broken out of the genjutsu he'd been under for almost a decade, because Ao eventually becomes an advisor to the Mizukage and uses his Byakugan on Yagura to see that his chakra is under genjutsu. But the stress of being broken out of that genjutsu is too much on Yagura's body, and Yagura dies, which is what kicks off the 3 Tails rescue mission arc, because Yagura dies while the Jinchuriki of Isobu, so Isobu regathers somewhere else. And if we're assuming that Itachi, Juzo, and Yagura cross paths 1, maybe less than 1 year after the Uchiha massacre, that would mean that Yagura would not only continue to be the Mizukage for another 8 to 9 years, but it would also be another 8 to 9 years that Obito could possibly control Yagura using Fugaku's wicked MS. And all of this corroborated by the first chapter of Sasuke Shinden, as Sasuke Shinden confirms that Mai, the 5th Mizukage, partook in the Shinobi Academy of the Blood Mist Village, where she had to kill her classmates. And since we know how old she is when she takes over as Mizukage, we know that Yagura was Mizukage for almost 20 years. And thus technically the timeline does provide us enough evidence to come to the conclusion that possibly Obito went through the Uchiha massacre to get Fugaku's eyes, which would not only explain why he participated, but would also explain why Itachi never got his own father's eyes. Now, unfortunately, it does ignore the fact that Obito, long before the Uchiha massacre, did have some incredible genjutsu prowess, but was that genjutsu prowess incredible enough to be actively compared to Koto Matsukame? I don't know. But when you consider the fact that that genjutsu prowess was actively something that Fugaku was said to be able to do, one can make the argument that on top of Kamui, Obito just simply happened to have Fugaku-level genjutsu prowess. But who's to say? Now that I've provided you the question and all the evidence I was able to gather, what do you guys think happened? Do you think that Obito went through with the Uchiha massacre to get his hands on a legendary set of eyes, or do you think this is all circumstantial? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Ooh, missed the feeling of answering questions.